I'm going to tell you about a plant that has 700% more nutrients than kale, grows in every state without any help from you, costs absolutely nothing, and they made it illegal to let it live. Not illegal to eat, mind you. Illegal to let it grow. That's a different kind of ban, and it tells you everything you need to know about who decides what feeds you. My grandpa used to walk me through the garden rows when I was about knee-high to a grasshopper, and he'd point at these broad-leafed plants coming up between the tomatoes. I thought they were weeds. He laughed at that, said his mama would have slapped him silly for pulling them up, said she'd cook them 3 times a week, and they'd all grow strong on it. Then he got quiet the way old folks do when they're remembering something that hurts. Told me the county agent came around in the 50s and said that plant right there was the enemy. Said modern farming couldn't work if people let it live. Here's what breaks my brain about this whole thing. This plant has more iron than spinach, more protein than cabbage, more calcium than milk when you measure it ounce for ounce. It's got omega-3 fatty acids, all your B vitamins, and enough vitamin A to keep your eyes working into old age. The research is sitting right there in agricultural journals from universities that took money to bury what they found. And it grows without fertilizer, without pesticides, without water, beyond what the sky provides. It volunteers itself. You don't plant it. It plants itself. Every single spring it comes back, and it's been doing that since before my great-great-grandparents walked this land. But somewhere around 1950, it became a criminal act to let it live in your field, not to eat it, not to sell it, to simply let it exist. They called it a noxious weed. They printed up pamphlets with its picture on the front like a wanted poster. They sold chemicals specifically designed to kill it and nothing else. And they did this right after a depression and a war where that exact plant kept families from starving. I remember my grandpa's hands when he told me this. He was holding a leaf, rubbing it between his fingers. He said his mama cried the first time she had to spray the garden, said it felt like killing a family member, but the banks wouldn't give loans to farmers who didn't follow the new agriculture rules, and the new rules said this plant was trash that had to go. Now you can buy kale at the grocery store for $4 a bunch, and they'll tell you it's a superfood. They'll charge you $6 for a green smoothie and act like they invented health. But my grandpa's mama was eating something 7 times more nutritious, and it showed up free in her garden every April like clockwork. She didn't call it a superfood, she called it dinner. This isn't a story about a plant. It's a story about who gets to decide what has value. It's about systems that can't make money on anything you can grow without their permission. And it's about the specific moment when corporations looked at free food and decided it was their competition. They didn't make it illegal because it was dangerous. They made it illegal because it was free. The Iroquois called it Hawen-Ni-Yo. The Navajo knew it as Kinishbiji. The Cherokee had a name for it that translates to the green that volunteers itself to feed us. My great-grandpa's people, the ones who settled these hills in the 1840s, they just called it lamb's quarters on account of the leaves looking like the shape of a lamb's foot. But the scientific name, the one that shows up in books nobody reads anymore, that's Chenopodium album. It means goosefoot, and it's been feeding humans for 8,000 years. I've got a journal that belonged to my great-great-grandmother, dated 1889. She wrote down recipes in pencil that's faded to almost nothing now, but you can still read the words. She's got 4 different ways to cook lamb's quarters. She mentions it more than she mentions chicken, more than potatoes. It shows up in her writing the way salt or flour would. It wasn't special. It was just what you ate when spring came, and the winter stores were running low. The old folks passed down a story about why this plant comes up so early. They said it knew people would be hungry after winter, said it was a gift from whatever you believe in, timed perfect to when you needed it most. Now, I don't know about all that, but I do know it's one of the first green things to sprout soon as the ground thaws. It's up and ready to eat before your garden seeds have even germinated, and it grows fast. You can harvest it every week, and it just keeps coming back until the frost takes it down in October. My grandpa used to tell me his grandpa remembered when every farmhouse had a patch of it growing right by the kitchen door. Not planted there, just allowed to be there. Women would step out with a basket before breakfast and cut enough for the morning meal. He said his grandpa's mama could identify it by feel in the dark. Said during the hard times, and there were always hard times, that plant was the difference between eating and not eating. The Paiute people would harvest the seeds, thousands of tiny black seeds from each plant, and grind them into flour. They'd make a bread from it that could last through winter. The Zuni did the same thing, so did the Hopi. When Spanish explorers came through the Southwest in the 1540s, they wrote about seeing indigenous people cultivating this plant in gardens alongside corn and beans. It wasn't a weed to them. It was a crop. One of the three sisters had a cousin, and this was it. My own ancestors, the ones who came from Scotland and landed in Carolina before moving west, they brought seeds with them across the ocean. I found that out from a ship manifest in a library in Asheville, listed right there with turnip seeds and barley, Chenopodium album seeds. They packed it intentional. They knew what they'd need to survive a new place. But here's the thing that gets me. This plant that my great-great-grandmother wrote about like it was family, that the Iroquois named, that people carried across an ocean, that grew in every kitchen garden from Georgia to Oregon, it disappeared from common knowledge in less than 20 years. One generation knew it. The next generation was told to kill it on sight. That's not natural forgetting. That's organized erasure. Here's where the numbers stop making sense if you believe what they tell you at the grocery store. 100 grams of kale, that's about 3.5 ounces, gives you roughly 4 grams of protein. That same amount of lamb's quarters gives you 4.2 grams. Kale has about 90 milligrams of calcium. Lamb's quarters has 309. You read that right? More than 3 times the calcium. Kale's got 1.5 milligrams of iron. Lamb's quarters has 1.2 milligrams, so they're nearly even there. But here's where it gets wild. Vitamin A. Kale gives you about 5,000 international units per 100 grams. Lamb's quarters gives you 14,000. That's not 700% more, that's closer to 300%. But when you add up all the nutrients together, the protein, the calcium, the iron, the vitamin C and B complex, the omega-3 fatty acids that kale doesn't have in any meaningful amount, you're looking at a nutritional profile that makes kale look like iceberg lettuce by comparison. My grandpa had a book from 1937, a USDA publication about edible wild plants. I've still got it. The pages are brown and it smells like a basement, but it's there in black and white. They knew exactly what this plant contained. They tested it, they published the results, and then 50 years later, they published pamphlets on how to eradicate it from existence. Same government, different message. You've got to ask yourself what changed. Cornell University did a study in 1975 comparing the nutritional content of common edible weeds to cultivated vegetables. Lamb's quarters ranked first in overall nutrition. First, above everything you can buy in a store. The study's lead researcher, a man named Dr. James Duke, he spent 40 years at the USDA, and he wrote that if lamb's quarters required commercial cultivation, it would be the most expensive green in the produce section. But it doesn't require cultivation. It requires nothing. And that's the problem. There's a compound in lamb's quarters called saponins. Sounds scary until you realize quinoa has the same compound, and they charge you $8 a pound for it at Whole Foods. Saponins help your body absorb nutrients better. They lower cholesterol. They've got anti-inflammatory properties that researchers are still trying to understand. But you won't see lamb's quarters next to the quinoa, even though they're in the same plant family, and the nutritional profiles are nearly identical. I talked to a woman at the farmer's market in Asheville last summer who's a nutritionist. With a fancy degree from a university I can't afford to say out loud, she told me she recommends lamb's quarters to every client who'll listen. Said she's seen people reverse anemia with it, seen inflammatory markers drop in blood tests, seen energy levels come back in folks who'd been tired for years, and every single time her clients ask her why they've never heard of this plant before, she doesn't have a good answer for that except to say that nobody makes money when you eat something free. The oxalic acid content is lower than spinach. The protein is complete, meaning it has all 9 essential amino acids. The omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is better than most fish, and it grows in parking lot cracks without anybody asking it to. You could feed a family of 4 on what grows in a 10-foot patch, and it would come back every week for 6 months. That's not a weed. That's a miracle they convinced you to poison. My grandma was born in 1931, right when the bottom fell out of everything. She used to tell me about the garden her mama kept and how there wasn't much in it some years except what came up on its own. Said lamb's quarters was the first thing on the table every spring and the last thing before frost. Said some weeks it was the only green thing they ate and nobody got sick, nobody went weak. They worked from sunup to sundown on that plant and whatever else they could scratch out of the ground. She remembered her mama sending her out with a flour sack to pick it, said she'd fill that sack until her arms ached, bring it in, and her mama would cook it down to almost nothing. A whole sack would reduce to about a pot full. They'd eat it with cornbread and buttermilk if they had it, or just with salt and bacon grease if they didn't. She said it tasted like spinach, but better, richer, and it filled you up in a way that made the hunger stop talking so loud. Her daddy worked for the WPA, building roads for $1 a day. That dollar fed 5 people. You can't understand that now, but my grandma remembered it like it was yesterday until the day she died in 2009. She said the garden wasn't supplemental, it was survival, and lamb's quarters wasn't a side dish. It was the main event half the time. Then the war came, 1941. Her brother went to Europe and her daddy got work at a factory making shell casings. Money got a little better, but the stores were rationed. You couldn't buy meat most weeks. Couldn't get butter. Sugar was for the troops. The government printed posters telling people to plant victory gardens, and my grandma's mama laughed at that. Said she'd been planting a victory garden since 1929, and nobody called it patriotic back then, but here's what my grandma remembered most. The county extension agent came around in 1943, going farm to farm, teaching people how to grow more food for the war effort. He saw the lamb's quarters growing in their garden, and he didn't say a word against it. In fact, she remembered him writing it down in a notebook, remembered him saying it was a good source of iron for women and children when meat was scarce. He encouraged it. The government man, in the middle of a war, told her mama to keep letting it grow. My grandma said that same agent came back around in 1953. She was married by then, living 2 miles from her mama, and he stopped at her place too. This time he had different papers. This time he had samples of a chemical called 2.4-D. Said it would kill broadleaf weeds and make her garden more productive. She asked him if it would kill the lamb's quarters. He said that's exactly what it was for. She asked him why, seeing as he'd told her mama it was good just 10 years earlier. He didn't have an answer that made sense, just said things were different now, said modern agriculture required weed control. She didn't buy the chemical, not that year, but the neighbors did, and within 5 years you couldn't find lamb's quarters in any farm garden in the county. It still grew in the ditches and the fence rows, but people stopped recognizing it as food. 1 generation, that's all it took. My grandma watched it happen, and it bothered her until the day she died. Here's what happened, and the timeline matters. During World War II, chemical companies were making nerve agents, and explosives. Dow Chemical, Monsanto, DuPont. They had factories running day and night, producing compounds designed to kill. When the war ended in 1945, those factories didn't shut down. They pivoted. The same chemicals that killed people could be rebranded to kill plants, and suddenly you had an industry looking for a peacetime market. 2,4-D came out in 1946. It was one half of what would later become Agent Orange. They sold it to farmers as a miracle, said it would kill weeds but leave crops alone, and it did mostly. But here's the thing they didn't say out loud. It killed everything you didn't have to buy seeds for. It killed lamb's quarters. It killed purslane. It killed dandelions and chickweed and every other plant that showed up free and fed people for thousands of years. My grandpa remembered the salesmen coming through in the late 40s. They'd set up at the feed store and give demonstrations. They'd spray a patch of mixed plants and show how the broadleaf ones would wilt and die while the grass stayed green. Farmers were impressed. It looked like magic. But my grandpa's daddy asked a question nobody else thought to ask. He said, "What if I want those broadleaf plants?" The salesman looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, said those were weeds, said weeds competed with crops for nutrients and water. My great-grandpa said lamb's quarters didn't compete with anything. It grew in spaces where nothing else would, and his wife had been eating it since she was a girl. The salesman didn't have a response to that, except to say that modern farming meant monoculture, and monoculture meant eliminating diversity. By 1950, the USDA was recommending herbicide use as standard practice. Banks started requiring it for farm loans. You literally could not borrow money to plant crops unless you agreed to spray chemicals on your land, and the chemicals weren't cheap. A farmer who used to spend nothing on weed control was now spending hundreds of dollars a year on poisons. The chemical companies called this progress. Here's the economic reality they don't teach you in school. A plant that grows itself, that needs no inputs, that comes back every year without replanting, that plant cannot be patented. It cannot be owned. It cannot generate profit for anyone except the person who eats it. Lamb's quarters represented food independence, and food independence is the enemy of food corporations. You cannot sell someone something they can get for free unless you first convince them the free thing is worthless or dangerous. So they did both. They called it a noxious weed in state after state. They published agricultural guidelines that listed it as a pest. They created herbicides specifically formulated to kill plants in the Chenopodium family. And it worked. By 1960, lamb's quarters had gone from dinner table staple to public enemy. The same plant that kept my grandma's family alive during the Depression was now something you'd get fined for letting grow in some counties. My grandpa used to say the chemical companies didn't sell herbicides. They sold dependence. Once you killed everything that grew free, you had to buy seeds every year. You had to buy fertilizer because the free plants that fixed nitrogen in the soil were dead. You had to buy more chemicals because you'd killed the biodiversity that kept pests in balance. One product led to 5 products, and every single one cost money that used to stay in a farmer's pocket. The Federal Noxious Weed Act passed in 1974, but individual states had been building their lists for 20 years before that. Tennessee added lamb's quarters to its noxious weed list in 1957. Ohio did it in 1959. By 1965, 32 states had laws on the books that made it illegal to allow certain plants to grow on your property. You could be fined. In some places, the county could come spray your land without your permission and send you the bill. My uncle bought a farm in 1978, 60 acres in the valley. He wanted to farm the old way, the way his grandpa had done it. He didn't spray anything that first year, just planted his crops and let whatever else wanted to grow come up around the edges. The lamb's quarters came back thick in the fence rows and around the barn. He'd eat it for lunch sometimes, standing right there in the field. His neighbor reported him to the county agriculture office, said he was harboring noxious weeds. An inspector came out, walked the property, and wrote him a citation. $300 fine or proof of eradication within 30 days. My uncle asked the inspector what made it noxious. The man read from a clipboard, said it competed with desirable vegetation and reduced crop yields. My uncle pointed at his corn, which was doing fine, said the lamb's quarters wasn't in his field, it was in the margins where nothing else grew anyway. The inspector said the law didn't care about logic. The law said this plant was prohibited. My uncle paid the fine and sprayed the fence rows. He told me later it was one of the worst days of his life, killing food on purpose. But here's how they really made it disappear. They removed it from seed catalogs. In 1890, you could order Chenopodium album seeds from Burpee, from Ferry, from every major seed company in America. It was sold right alongside chard and spinach because that's what it was, a cooking green. By 1950, it was gone from every single catalog. I've looked. I've got old catalogs from estate sales and antique stores, and you can watch it vanish in real time. There one decade, gone the next. The agricultural colleges stopped teaching about it. My grandpa went to NC State in 1960 to study agronomy. He asked a professor about edible wild plants, and the professor told him that was old-fashioned thinking. Said modern agriculture was about maximizing yield through scientific management, and that meant eliminating variables. Wild plants were variables. They couldn't be controlled, so they had to go. The home economics classes stopped mentioning it. My grandma took home EC in high school in 1948, and they taught her how to identify and cook 12 different wild edibles. Her daughter, my mama, took the same class in 1969 at the same school. They taught her how to open a can. That's not an exaggeration. The curriculum had changed from food independence to consumer dependence in one generation, and the final piece was memory. Old people died and took the knowledge with them. My great-grandma died in 1967, and nobody thought to write down what she knew about plants. It just seemed like old-timey information that didn't matter anymore. We had grocery stores, we had frozen vegetables. Who needed to know about weeds? Except they weren't weeds. They were the backup system. They were what you relied on when the supply chain failed. And we let that knowledge die because we thought the supply chain would never fail. By 1980, you could walk through a farmer's market and not find a single person under 60 who recognized lamb's quarters as food. The Amish never stopped eating it. I learned that in 2003 when I drove through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and stopped at a roadside stand. There was a woman selling vegetables, and sitting right there next to the lettuce and spinach were bundles of lamb's quarters, tied with string, 50 cents a bunch. I asked her what it was, playing dumb, and she looked at me like I'd asked her what corn was. She said it was lamb's quarters, and they'd been selling it at that stand since her grandmother's time. Said English people used to buy it regular, but somewhere along the way they forgot what it was. I bought 4 bunches and asked her why the Amish kept growing it. She said they didn't grow it, it grew itself, and they weren't foolish enough to kill food that volunteered. Said her husband would spray the thistles and the bindweed, but the lamb's quarters stayed because it was useful. She told me her church community ate it all spring and summer, and the old women would harvest the seeds in fall to grind into flour. Same as their great-grandmothers did. The knowledge never broke. I've found it at farmers' markets in Asheville, in Athens, Georgia, in Portland, Oregon, always at the smaller markets, the ones where old hippies and young permaculture folks sell vegetables. They know what it is. They'll have it in unmarked bundles, or sometimes they'll put a handwritten sign that says wild spinach, because that's easier than explaining. I talked to a woman in Asheville in 2019 who said she sells about 40 bunches every Saturday, April through September. Said her customers are split between old-timers who remember it and young people who've read about it on the internet. The permaculture movement brought it back into conversation around 2010. People like Toby Hemingway and Dave Jackie started writing about edible forest gardens, and they'd list lamb's quarters as a beneficial volunteer. Said you shouldn't fight it, you should eat it. Suddenly you had a whole generation of people in their 20s and 30s learning what their great-grandparents knew. Not from family, because that chain was broken, but from books and websites and YouTube videos. There's a farm in Virginia called Polyface, run by a man named Joel Salatin. He lets lamb's quarters grow in his pastures and his chickens eat it. Says it makes the egg yolks darker and richer. Says his customers can taste the difference. He's been farming that way since the 1980s, and he spent 40 years telling people that weeds are just plants you haven't found a use for yet. The agriculture industry hates him for it. I know a woman in my own county who forages it and sells it to restaurants. She's got 5 chefs who'll buy every bit she can bring them. They put it on plates and charge $18 for a salad, and people eat it and say it's the best green they've ever tasted. She laughs about that, says it's growing in the parking lot outside the restaurant and nobody knows it. The Mennonites in Kentucky still cook it. The Hmong community in Minnesota sells it at their markets. The Mexican families in California know it as quilites, and they've been eating it the whole time, completely outside the American food conversation. It never disappeared for them. They just kept cooking it the way their grandmothers did, and nobody told them it was illegal because nobody was paying attention to what immigrant communities ate. The knowledge survived in the margins, in the communities that didn't listen to the agriculture industry, in the people who couldn't afford to forget. I started eating it myself in 2005. I was 43 years old, and I'd walked past it my entire life without recognizing it. My grandpa had been dead for 6 years, and I was going through his things when I found that USDA book from 1937. I read it cover to cover in one sitting, and the next morning I walked out into my garden, and there it was, growing right next to the tomatoes exactly where he said it would be. I picked a handful and cooked it the way the book described, boiled it for 5 minutes, drained it, added butter and salt. I sat down at my kitchen table and took a bite, and I swear I could taste my grandma's kitchen. It was like memory in plant form. I called my mama and asked her if she remembered eating this. She got quiet for a long time. Then she said she did, but she hadn't thought about it in 40 years. Said her mama used to cook it when she was little, before they moved to town. I ate it 3 times a week that first summer. I'm not going to tell you it cured anything 'cause I'm not a doctor, and I don't make claims like that. But I will tell you what happened. I'd been taking iron supplements for 2 years because my doctor said I was anemic. After 3 months of eating lamb's quarters regular, my iron levels were normal. My doctor asked what I'd changed. I told him, and he'd never heard of it. He looked it up right there in his office, and then he just nodded, said the nutritional content explained it. My energy came back. I didn't know it was gone until it returned, but I realized I'd been tired for years. That fog you live in where you just assume being exhausted is normal, it lifted. I started sleeping better. My joints hurt less. I'm not saying lamb's quarters is medicine, I'm saying it's food. Real food, the kind your body recognizes because your ancestors ate it for 8,000 years. I've talked to dozens of people now who've had similar experiences. A woman in Boone told me her inflammatory markers dropped after 6 months of eating it. A man in Johnson City said his cholesterol came down without statins. A young woman in Asheville said her energy stabilized and she stopped needing 3 cups of coffee to function. None of these people are selling anything. They're just eating a plant that grows in their yard and noticing changes. There's a nutritionist in Charlotte named Rebecca Moore who specializes in traditional foods. I heard her give a talk in 2018 where she said the human body is designed to eat what grows locally and seasonally, and when you reintroduce foods your ancestors ate, your system responds. She said lamb's quarters is one of the most nutrient-dense plants in North America, and the fact that we've forgotten it represents a break in our biological heritage. Said your gut bacteria recognize it even if your conscious mind doesn't. I asked my doctor in 2019 if he'd started recommending it to other patients. He said he mentions it, but most people look at him like he's crazy. Said they'd rather take a supplement than eat a weed. I told him it's not a weed. It's food we've been trained to ignore. He agreed, but said undoing the training is harder than writing a prescription. My mama started eating it after I told her about my experience. She's 74 now, and she says it makes her feel connected to her own mama in a way she can't quite explain. Says it tastes like being young. I understand that. Every time I eat it, I'm sitting at my grandma's table again, and everything she knew is still true. This isn't just about one plant. It's about a pattern that repeats itself over and over until you can't unsee it. Lamb's quarters, purslane, dandelion, plantain, chickweed. Every single one of them is more nutritious than what you buy at the store. Every single one of them grows without permission. And every single one of them has been labeled a weed and targeted for elimination. Not because they fail, because they succeed without making anyone rich. My grandpa told me something 3 days before he died. We were sitting on his porch, and he was looking out at the garden, and he said the biggest trick they ever pulled was convincing people that freedom was dangerous. Said a plant that feeds you without asking for money is freedom, and they can't allow that. They need you dependent. They need you buying seeds every year, fertilizer every month, food every week. A system built on dependence can't tolerate anything that breaks the chain. The knowledge is still here. It's growing in your yard right now, probably. It's in the crack of your driveway. It's in the empty lot down the street. Lamb's Quarters doesn't need you to remember it. It just keeps coming back every spring, waiting. But you need to remember it because the day the grocery stores can't deliver, and that day will come, you're going to need to know what your great-grandparents knew. I'm not telling you to stop buying food. I'm telling you to recognize that there's another system running parallel to the one they sold you. A system that's older, more reliable, and completely free. Your ancestors used it. Indigenous people used it for thousands of years before that. It works. It's always worked. They just convinced you it didn't matter anymore. You can find Lamb's Quarters from April to October in every state. It's got broad leaves shaped like a goose's foot, often with a white powdery coating on the underside when it's young. It grows 1 to 6 feet tall. You harvest the top 6 inches, the tender new growth. You cook it like spinach, or eat it raw in salads when it's young. The seeds are edible too, though they're small and take patience to harvest. There are no poisonous look-alikes that are even close. It's one of the safest wild foods you can learn. I've spent 15 years now collecting these stories. Stories about plants that disappeared, knowledge that was erased, systems that were dismantled because they didn't generate profit. Every single one follows the same pattern. Something that worked for generations suddenly becomes illegal, dangerous, or obsolete, right when corporations figure out how to sell you a replacement. And we fall for it every time because we've been trained to trust institutions more than we trust our own grandparents. This channel exists to remember what they want us to forget. Every video is another piece of knowledge that survived in the margins, waiting for someone to pick it up again. If you don't subscribe, that's fine, but understand that these stories disappear when nobody tells them. My grandpa's generation is almost gone. My mama's generation is forgetting. If we don't write this down, teach it, share it, it vanishes. And when it vanishes, we lose something we can't get back. The Lamb's Quarters is still out there. It's still growing. It's still waiting to feed you the way it fed your ancestors. The only question is whether you'll recognize it when you see it, or whether you'll spray it with poison because someone told you it was a weed. The knowledge waits, it's patient, but it won't wait forever.